Chapter 2 of The Wrong Box. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Wrong Box by Robert Louis Stevenson and Lloyd Osborne. Chapter 2 in which Morris takes action. Some days later, accordingly, the three males of this depressing family might have been observed, by a reader of G.P.R. James, taking their departure from the East Station of Bournemouth. The weather was raw and changeable, and Joseph was arrayed in consequence according to the principles of Sir Faraday Bond, a man no less strict, as is well known, on costume than on diet. There are few polite invalids who have not lived, or tried to live, by that punctilious physician's orders. "Avoid tea, madam," the reader has doubtless heard him say. "Avoid tea, fried liver, antimonial wine, and baker's bread. Retire nightly at 10:45, and close yourself, if you please, throughout in hygienic flannel. Externally, the fur of the marten is indicated. Do not forget to procure a pair of health boots at Messrs. Dale and Crumbie's." And he has probably called you back, even after you have paid your fee, to add with stentorian emphasis, "I had forgotten one caution. Avoid kippered sturgeon as you would the very devil." The unfortunate Joseph was cut to the pattern of Sir Faraday in every button. He was shod with the health boot, his suit was of genuine ventilating cloth, his shirt of hygienic flannel, a somewhat dingy fabric, and he was draped to the knees in the inevitable greatcoat of marten's fur. The very railway porters at Bournemouth, which was a favourite station of the doctor's, marked the old gentleman for a creature of Sir Faraday. There was but one evidence of personal taste, a vizarded forage cap. From this form of headpiece, since he had fled from a dying jackal on the plains of Ephesus, and weathered a borer in the Adriatic, nothing could divorce our traveller. The three Finsburys mounted into their compartment, and fell immediately to quarrelling, a step unseemly in itself, and, in this case, highly unfortunate for Morris. Had he lingered a moment longer by the window, this tale need never have been written, for he might then have observed, as the porters did not fail to do, the arrival of a second passenger in the uniform of Sir Faraday Bond. But he had other matters on hand, which he judged, God knows how erroneously, to be more important. "I never heard of such a thing," he cried, resuming a discussion which had scarcely ceased all morning. "The bill is not yours, it's mine." "It is payable to me," returned the old gentleman, with an air of bitter obstinacy. "I will do what I please with my own property." The bill was one for £800, which had been given him at breakfast to endorse, and which he had simply pocketed. "Hear him, Johnny!" cried Morris. "His property! The very clothes upon his back belong to me." "Let him alone," said John. "I'm sick of both of you." "That is no way to speak of your uncle, sir. I will not endure this disrespect. You are a pair of exceedingly forward, impudent, and ignorant young men, and I have quite made up my mind to put an end to the whole business." "Oh, skittles!" said the graceful John. But Morris was not so easy in his mind. This unusual act of insubordination had already troubled him, and these mutinous words now sounded ominously in his ears. He looked at the old gentleman uneasily. Upon one occasion, many years before, when Joseph was delivering a lecture, the audience had revolted in a body, finding their entertainer somewhat dry. They had taken the question of amusement into their own hands, and the lecturer, along with the bored schoolmaster, the Baptist clergyman, and a working man's candidate who made up his bodyguard, was ultimately driven from the scene. Morris had not been present on that fatal day. If he had, he would have recognised a certain fighting glitter in his uncle's eye, and a certain chewing movement of his lips, as old acquaintances. But even to the inexpert these symptoms breathed of something dangerous. "Well, well," said Morris, "I have no wish to bother you further till we get to London. Joseph did not so much as look at him in answer. With tremulous hands he produced a copy of the British Mechanic, and ostentatiously buried himself in its perusal. "I wonder what can make him so cantankerous," reflected the nephew. "I don't like the look of it at all." And he dubiously scratched his nose. The train travelled forth into the world, bearing along with it the customary freight of obliterated voyagers, and along with these old Joseph, affecting immersion in his paper, and John slumbering over the columns of the Pink 'Un, and Morris revolving in his mind a dozen grudges and suspicions and alarms. It passed Christchurch by the sea, Herne with its pine woods, Ringwood on its mazy river. A little behind time, but not much for the South Western, it drew up at the platform of a station in the midst of the New Forest, the real name of which, in case the railway company might have the law of me, I shall veil under the alias of Browndean. Many passengers put their heads to the window, and among the rest an old gentleman, on whom I willingly dwell, for I am nearly done with him now, and, in the whole course of the present narrative, I am not in the least likely to meet another character so decent. His name is immaterial, not so his habits. He had passed his life wandering in a tweed suit on the continent of Europe, and years of Galignani's Messenger having at length undermined his eyesight, he suddenly remembered the rivers of Assyria, and came to London to consult an oculist. From the oculist to the dentist, and from both to the physician, the step appears inevitable. Presently he was in the hands of Sir Faraday, robed in ventilating cloth, and sent to Bournemouth; and to that domineering baronet, who was his only friend upon his native soil, he was now returning to report. The case of these tweed suited wanderers is unique. We have all seen them entering the table d'hote at Spezia, or Gratz, or Venice, with a genteel melancholy and a faint appearance of having been to India and not succeeded. In the offices of many hundred hotels they are known by name, and yet, if the whole of this wandering cohort were to disappear to morrow, their absence would be wholly unremarked. How much more if only one, say this one in the ventilating cloth, should vanish? He had paid his bills at Bournemouth, his worldly effects were all in the van in two portmanteaux, and these, after the proper interval, would be sold as unclaimed baggage to a Jew. Sir Faraday's butler would be a half-crown poorer at the year's end, and the hotel keepers of Europe, at about the same date, would be mourning a small, but quite observable, decline in profits. And that would be literally all. Perhaps the old gentleman thought something of the sort, for he looked melancholy enough as he pulled his bare grey head back into the carriage, and the train smoked under the bridge, and forth with ever quickening speed across the mingled heaths and woods of the New Forest. Not many hundred yards beyond Browndean, however, a sudden jarring of brakes set everybody's teeth on edge, and there was a brutal stoppage. Morris Finsbury was aware of a confused uproar of voices, and sprang to the window. Women were screaming, men were tumbling from the windows on the track, the guard was crying to them to stay where they were. At the same time the train began to gather way and move very slowly backwards towards Browndean, and the next moment all these various sounds were blotted out in the apocalyptic whistle and thundering onslaught of the down express. The actual collision Morris did not hear. Perhaps he fainted. He had a wild dream of having seen the carriage double up and fall to pieces like a pantomime trick, and sure enough, when he came to himself, he was lying on the bare earth and under the open sky. His head ached savagely. He carried his hand to his brow, and was not surprised to see it red with blood. The air was filled with an intolerable throbbing roar, which he expected to find die away with the return of consciousness, and instead of that it seemed but to swell the louder, and to pierce the more cruelly through his ears. It was a raging, bellowing thunder, like a boiler riveting factory. And now curiosity began to stir, and he sat up and looked about him. The track at this point ran in a sharp curve about a wooded hillock. All of the near side was heaped with the wreckage of the Bournemouth train, that of the express was mostly hidden by the trees, and just at the turn, under clouds of vomiting steam, and piled about with cairns of living coal, lay what remained of the two engines, one upon the other. On the heathy margin of the